colour line? Was your family removed from its home, for example, as were colours in District 6, and dumped somewhere else according to the Group Areas Act, or placed later on into some kind of Bantu/Arabstan? None of these things apply to Azmi Bashara. On the contrary, here's a man who not only voted for the parliament of the society in which he lived, but was elected to the Knesset, sat in the Knesset, was able there and elsewhere, I heard him many times, say more or less the same thing as he said there, except in a more refined, intellectual and honest fashion. All of these things demonstrate in themselves the utter fallacy of his charge. Now, as I say, there's no point in going on with the whole list. I'm not going to make the contrast between every specific act and manifestation of what was apartheid and what actually is the situation in Israel. But I think it's more important to place the emphasis on three more profound issues that I raised in the form of three simple questions. The first is, how can we compare the historical context of South Africa in which apartheid developed, on the one hand, and Israel on the other? The second is the question, and this is the important question, what actually was the moral justification for the utter excoriation of apartheid, universally almost, that could lead to sanctions, boycotts, and so on? And thirdly, what changed in South Africa that could lead to the kind of resolution of the conflict that we know occurred from about 1990 or 1994 onwards? The historical context. Now, people know very little, not only about Israel, as was mentioned by David, but also about the history of South Africa. Most people don't realize that the manifestations of the kind that I mentioned, more or less, of the apartheid system, existed for well over 100 years, and particularly since the creation of the Union of South Africa in the year 1910. They did not commence in 1948 when the National Afrikaner Party came into power. What the Afrikaner National Party did after 1948 was merely the systematization and institutionalization of a societal system that had always existed. And the parents and grandparents of those of us here who come from South Africa came to a country which already had that system. Now, this was done in order to buttress that societal system against what was called by one British Prime Minister not long after the Second World War as the winds of change in Africa, in order to buttress the domination over a black majority of the white population which had gone on for generations. And they did this by closing all the loopholes in the system, systematizing it in every way, both ideologically and in terms of all the laws and legalities that they could muster through the democratic system, which was a democratic system always only for the whites. Blacks never had a vote in South Africa. At the most, a few white representatives were allowed to sit in the parliament, and all this long before apartheid. Now, the point then is that the entire conflict situation that developed in South Africa was a conflict over the sharing with equal rights of a singular whole society. That's what the African National Congress was fighting for. There was no significant element of nationalism, that is to say, the seeking of of national self-determination at issue in that conflict. National self-determination was an issue earlier in the history of South Africa between the Afrikaners and British imperialism. That was not the goal set out by those who fought against the system. It was a struggle for equal rights in a society that was interdependent in many, many ways, not only economically. The history of the conflict in Israel is entirely different. It violates historical context utterly to make out that this was the same context. In Israel, the struggle has always been between two national movements, striving for national self-determination or national self-fulfillment in the same territory. That which the Jews prefer to call Eretz Israel, and which the Arab world, Palestinian Arabs, prefer to call Palestine. It's a struggle between two national movements, and as it was put very succinctly by two scholars, a husband and wife team, Herbert Adam and Kagila Moodley. She's an Indian, he's originally German. They both met and taught in South Africa, and they've written the most thoroughly academic and serious study of the subject in a book that was entitled Seeking Mandela, produced some time ago. And they summed it up succinctly, as I say, by showing in their analysis, which was not particularly sympathetic to the Jews or to Israel, that in the South African situation, it's a question of marriage, seeking marriage and sharing in a society. The historical context, as they said in Israel, is a process seeking divorce or dividing. And these are two different directions that beckon for any possible solution to the problem, arising from the entirely different historical context of both situations. This is the deeper fundamental difference which is completely distorted in all the propaganda attacks based upon the libel that Israel is an apartheid state and is in that sense completely comparable to what happened in South Africa. Now the second question, why was it morally justified, and universally seen to be so, to excoriate completely the apartheid regime? Not because this was an ethnic conflict. There are many, many ethnic conflicts in the world. Not even because this was a minority ethnic group which had domination over a majority population. This too exists and has existed in many parts of the world. What was so open, and justly so, to other condemnation was firstly that all of this was based upon racist beliefs. When I say racist, I mean it was predicated on the tenet that white-skinned Europeans were genetically superior beings, or at least inherently entitled to superior status in relation to people of other colors. And the second reason was that the dominant white group exercised unilateral social and political engineering of all kinds, along with complete refusal to negotiate